One of the biggest questions in linguistics has always been, how do we acquire language? This question gets especially interesting when looking at second language acquisition, which happens very differently than that of a first, so a native language. There are many different theories that try to explain different aspects of these processes, and they often come in dichotomies, such as one of the most important ones, which is the concept of explicit, so learned, and implicit, so acquired knowledge. Basically, the learner is aware of the prior, so the learned knowledge, because that's an active process. And that's usually learned through explanations and studying rules, while learners are usually unaware of the latter, unless they are made aware, since it is acquired solely through exposure to a language. This all may sound very, very intuitive and logical, but this theory is actually not undebated, because although researchers largely agree that knowledge of a first language is mostly implicit, both explicit and implicit knowledge seem to play important roles in most learning processes, including that of second languages. That's kind of the diplomatic, middle-of-the-road way of looking at things, right? But there is, of course, linguists who have less diplomatic views on this issue, one of them being Stephen KRASHEN. We're not going to get too much into who this guy is right now. This is what he looks like, and he's a well-known, pretty important linguist and researcher. And through this research, KRASHEN came to the conclusion that explicit knowledge can never be turned into implicit knowledge. This idea, or let's call it what it is, a theory that is commonly known as the non-interface position, is as overgeneralizing as it is flawed. So let's do a little bit of a shallow dive into a linguistic specificity, some nerdiness about languages, and the ever-present importance of defining your terms, because this is stuff I am interested in, and it's one of my papers. Part 1. KRASHEN'S Research and Theories. So to understand KRASHEN'S position and possible criticism of it, we first need to look at the development of the theory itself. What is called the non-interface position now largely developed out of 5 connected hypotheses that are also known as a whole as the monitor model, or the monitor theory, or the input hypothesis model. Now you can pick whichever one of those you like. There's different reasons for why they were come up with, and different people use different ones. They all refer to the same thing. Now, as I mentioned, this is not an undebated topic, and KRASHEN wasn't the first person to talk about this, obviously. Well, or maybe not obviously, but I imagine it's no surprise. And he therefore bases the monitor model on not only his own research, but also on both theoretical and experimental data produced by other linguists. And all of this he then packed up into these following 5 hypotheses as a crucial base for his convictions regarding second language acquisition. First hypothesis, the acquisition hypothesis. The acquisition hypothesis, also referred to as the acquisition learning distinction by KRASHEN, states that when looking at adult second language acquisitions, and we're not talking about kids, the issue gets a bit different there, but adults learning any second language, regardless of whether that is their actual second language besides their native one, or their third or fourth or whatever, a non-native language. When we're looking at that, we have to consider 2 different ways of reaching the goal, which is acquisition of that new language. Now, if you've been listening, the spelling out of these 2 methods isn't going to surprise you. It is, of course, again, the distinction between implicit, so acquired knowledge, and explicit, so learned knowledge. Now, this may seem self-evident at first, it certainly did to me, but KRASHEN claims it was long assumed that implicit learning is reserved only for children, while adults can only learn, not acquire, a language after they've gone through puberty. Meaning he does maintain that adults are in fact still able to acquire language largely without formal instruction on grammar, so the super explicit kind of learning. But the remaining question then is, what is the right balance of explicit and implicit, and is there even such a thing? This is all going to sound very basic, but we need to build this up in order to get to conclusions. This is just generally how science goes. You start with some very basic stuff so you can go, okay, if this is true, and this is true, and this is true, and if we take that together, then I'm saying this is also true. All right, so let's look at some basic shit. Second hypothesis, the natural order hypothesis. This hypothesis states that acquisition of certain elements of language follow almost identical patterns in every learner of a language. This has been observed in both adults and in children for both first language acquisition and second language acquisition. There's one super important study that is referenced most often in this context, that being one by Roger Brown from 1973, for which he observed the grammatical development of 3 children learning English as their native language. And the conclusions he could draw from this study was that, firstly, all learners of a language acquire grammatical morphemes, so grammatical concepts in a way. So basically how you use certain structures in a sentence to express a certain type of meaning. And all people learning a certain language acquire such morphemes, so units of meaning, constructs of meaning, in about the same order. And secondly, that order mostly coincides with the difficulty or complexity of those grammatical concepts. Basically, there's concepts that are way easier to understand than others. A pretty difficult concept is negation. And now, while a phrase like I can't, I don't may seem pretty simple, it's, negation also includes stuff like I didn't do that, or there aren't any apples left. And that's a bit more tricky. And therefore, those difficult concepts or morphemes are usually grasped and acquired last. Now, of course, it's not the exact same order for every learner, but what Brown observed and what many other people after him basically tested and confirmed again and again was that the more difficult a grammatical concept, the later we learn it. The important part for Krashen about this whole thing is that this development, this observable pattern, is natural, quote unquote, meaning that it doesn't come through instruction, but through a constant stream of input that then lets the learner acquire the grammar freely and according to how it, comes to them, how it comes naturally. And yet the order stays very, very similar, observably similar for everyone who learns a given language. So bottom line, there is such a thing as a natural order according to Krashen's second hypothesis, and that's not in some sort of weird racist way. It's merely relating to there's a natural order to how we pick up certain grammatical concepts when we're learning a language, regardless of our age and regardless of our status as a native or non-native speaker. All right, moving on. Third hypothesis, the monitor hypothesis. Now, the monitor hypothesis, and you can already tell by the term, we're getting a bit closer to the core of Krashen's actual own input here. The monitor hypothesis stipulates that explicit knowledge, so learned knowledge, is only used as a quote-unquote monitor in second language acquisition, meaning explicit knowledge is only used to actively, knowingly monitor and check whether the speech that you produce out of your implicit knowledge is correct or not, so that you can adjust it if necessary. The degree to which this is used varies individually, based on how much you care about it, based on how aware you are about it, based on how much you learned about it, etc. But Krashen claims that all we do with our explicit language knowledge, stuff we learn in school, in speech courses, in whatever it is, we only use that to check what we already know. It doesn't actually help us learn new things, which means explicit knowledge about language may come in handy at times. It'll certainly help you speak more quickly, but it is not at all the crucial factor in language acquisition and much more of a stepping stone, according to Krashen. He also elaborates on this a bit more by saying that learners need 3 things to be able to consciously use knowledge as a monitor. One is time to consider the rules that they are aware of. 2, focus on form, so an actual intrinsic concern with the correctness of the utterance. If you don't care about how correct your speech is, you're not going to try to actively monitor it. And thirdly, knowledge of the required rule. So, that's kind of obvious, right? You can't check something if you don't know the rule. So, 3 things. You need the time to actually go through what you said. You need to actually care about being speaking correctly, and you need to obviously know the rule that you would need to check whether what you said is correct. Now, put in a position where all three of these were provided, subjects made different errors than they would have in natural production, and they were in fact more likely to produce correct usage of grammatical morphemes, grammatical constructions. What is noteworthy about this is that this change could only be called significant enough, so it was present otherwise, but significant, in a situation where the learners were aware that their grammar was being tested in particular. So even if it was just a general testing situation, that didn't cause noticeable changes as compared to a situation where they were told explicitly, your grammar is what we're looking at here. Now, this already kind of implies something that I want to question here. That being, basically, we don't really need explicit knowledge unless we want to be nerds about it and be super exact. It's nice to be able to confirm or adjust correctness, but it's not when you need to actually learn a language. But we're not there yet. Let's move on to the next hypothesis first. Hypothesis 4. Or fourth hypothesis. I don't know which way around I phrased it. I'm too lazy to check. Fourth hypothesis, the input hypothesis. Now, in his book that all this comes from, that being Principles and Practice in Second Language Acquisition, KRASHEN kind of self-congratulates himself on this particular hypothesis as this being, quote, maybe the single most important concept in second language acquisition today. All right. Let's check it out. We're gonna have a minute amount of a conceptual number, but we'll get to that in a second. So, the input hypothesis aims at finding an ideal formula for constantly providing the learner with input that is just above their current level in order to enable them to progress naturally in the acquisition of a language. Meaning you can't jump too far ahead, they'll get demotivated, they won't know what's going on, but you also can't pamper them by only exposing them to stuff that they definitely already know. You always need to slightly and productively overwhelm them. Little baby steps of overwhelming are helpful in learning a language properly, naturally. And that's what is basically the input hypothesis. KRASHEN boils this down to, and here's the tiny amount of baby math, he boils this down into I plus 1, meaning input, that's the I, that consists of the learner's current knowledge, however much that is, plus something that is just outside of said knowledge. See, it's not any mathematician that watches this is going to yell about how inaccurate this is, but the 1 here is just less of a concrete number and more of an idea of this is the next piece of input that you need to advance further naturally. Which immediately brings us to the next point. The somewhat more complicated part of this idea is then determining what constitutes the just outside element, that is the 1. The input hypothesis incorporates a theory that I plus 1 is in fact not necessarily a new concept that is purposefully added to the conversation or context, but again, best comes through communication. So again, naturally. So if the learner understands new input, then I plus 1 is achieved. It doesn't need to be built up explicitly or intentionally. This happens even if, or rather especially if, that comprehension comes through understanding the context rather than every speech item. So that frustrating thing when you're trying to listen to the news in the language that you're trying to learn and you feel like you're only understanding 30%? That's not a bad thing, because if you do that often enough, you're going to start understanding a little bit more every time. That's basically what the I plus 1 is, ideally. This in turn then means that emergence of speech production and fluency both cannot be forced and best come naturally through a constant stream of comprehensible input, just a bit outside of what is easily comprehensible, but still comprehensible as a whole, slowly advancing the learner one step at a time at their respective pace. Our fifth and final hypothesis, the affective filter hypothesis. Now, this term was first coined by Dilley and Burt in 1977, and it refers to the impact of secondary factors, so affective variables. By the way, that's affective with an A. It doesn't mean effective as in this is a good thing that works, that has good affect, it means affective, so emotion-led, basically. So we have these secondary factors, also known as affective variables, on the progression and success in second language acquisition. That being motivation, self-confidence, and anxiety. This is purely relating to language acquisition, right? Motivation for learning, self-confidence about what you have already learned or what you're able to do, and anxiety about failing, about messing up, about not understanding, about etc., etc. Now, higher motivation and self-confidence usually lead to noticeably better results. What a surprise. And regarding anxiety, a low level is more constructive. That is a nice way of saying if you're stressed out about it all the time, you ain't gonna do well. Again, I don't think I need to tell that to anybody on the internet, but it's here for completion's sake. All right, so depending on individual combinations of these three affective variables, learners will experience differences in the language acquisition, and these can actually be pretty drastic depending on where you're at in those three, because these are brought about by their general attitudes towards the entire process. Now, having a lot of anxiety around this would mean that you have a high affective filter that the input has to go through before it reaches the language acquisition device. That's the term that Deli and Burt use, but that's actually a term that's originally coined by Noam Chomsky, who, besides having a lot of opinions and insight on political issues, is actually a stellar and extremely important linguist. And he coined this idea of a language acquisition device. Basically, we all have this little box in our brains that has the basic ability to acquire language. That's a super, super shortened version of what that is, but that's not the main goal of talking about things today, so I'm going to leave it at that. But basically, every language input reaches that language acquisition device at some point, and Krashen says that a high affective filter, so your motivation, your self-confidence, and your anxiety, very much impacts how your input, the input you get, reaches that acquisition device. And of course, if that high affective filter is anxiety laden, it's going to inhibit acquisition. So filtered down, we have these 5 statements that we can boil it down to. 1. Learning does not equal acquisition. 2. Acquisition happens in similar patterns in every learner. 3. Conscious or explicit knowledge can be used to monitor output. 4. Acquisition is best achieved through comprehensible input. And 5. The acquisition process only reaches its full potential if the learner has a low affective filter. Okay, part 3. The non-interface position. So, that was all background information. This is all shit you need to be established. Okay, now, with this background, we can now take a look at what emerges from these hypotheses. That being the non-interface position. The stance that explicit and implicit knowledge don't transition into or even influence each other. Again, in case you forgot about that point, Krashen's main idea is implicit knowledge needs to come from input. Explicit knowledge is just a nice extra that helps you check what you already know. All right? That is the non-interface position that we arrive at if we take together all of the 5 hypotheses. As a little aside, to be exact, he himself never assigned the term to it. It can be viewed as a substrate of Krashen's general stance on the question of language acquisition. Putting all of this together, Krashen thusly presents the non-interface position as such. Explicit knowledge cannot become or even significantly aid implicit knowledge. He sees its usefulness restricted to the aforementioned monitoring function, which doesn't play a role in fluent speech. So acquiring grammar rules, like everything else, is a matter of understanding the right, i.e. comprehensible input, making prior knowledge of a rule unnecessary. So again, it's just for grammar nerds who want to be like, did I say that right? Yes, I said that right. Oh god, I'm so good and I know the rule too. That's it. You won't learn anything from it that you don't already know. So you might as well not learn it. That's basically what we need to come to. This statement comes pretty easily if you universally apply the input formula I+1, which just because it's so dang simple and arguably vague, you can just throw that at everything and be like, see, you see, it's I+1, it's worked. To quote Krashen on this, The trivial sense in which a conscious rule might, quote-unquote, help language acquisition is if the performer used a rule as a monitor and consistently applied it to his own output. Since we understand our own output, part of that performer's comprehensible input would include utterances with that structure. When the day came when that performer was ready to acquire this already learned rule, his own performance of it would qualify as comprehensible input at I+1. In other words, self-stimulation. Detangling the bit of academic babble at the end there, according to this, learning a rule is unnecessary because it's only used for monitoring until acquisition, and acquisition is not actually achieved through the knowledge of said rule, but through constantly using one's own output as input. So the more you speak, the more you write, etc., the more you get to monitor, the more you get to actually redigest, basically. So when you get to a point where you can confidently and consciously use a rule that you learned just as a rule, you're at a point where you don't need it anymore, so you might have not needed it in the first place. So basically, in other words, if I wanted to be a bit critical about it, because of its relative vagueness, I+1 can be quoted for absolutely every process in second language acquisition, which is actually precisely KRASHEN'S point. But we'll pick that back up in just a little bit when we get to other people taking critical stances towards this. Part 4. Other perspectives. Now, unsurprisingly, there's going to be opinions on this, and there have been a number of people who have voiced their opinion since the publication of KRASHEN'S theories, some of which we'll take a look at now. I'll start with the supporting voices, build them up strongly, and then we'll get to the critics. Now we have a pair of scientists, Scarcella and Perkins, trying to strengthen KRASHEN, making an attempt at summarizing and commenting on the validity of KRASHEN'S research. This was in 1987. The theory has been around for a while, as you can see. Their main point in this was that while clearly there were many things that still needed to be evaluated and researched concerning the implications of KRASHEN's fairly bold statements, the hypothesis in itself should be seen as having great potential once refined and specified regarding, the realms in which it can be useful and applicable. This is kind of a tendency in general with people who commented on the whole issue on the theory. They seem to agree with many, if not most, of KRASHEN's premises, such as the differentiation between implicit and explicit knowledge and the necessity of comprehensible input. So there's not much controversy about those points. McLaughlin also points out that the basic theory in itself is, quote, extensive and detailed, and that it would benefit from other researchers improving on what it's lacking. Both he and another researcher who was generally more critical, named Greg, also point out a general enthusiasm regarding the theory outside of the purely linguistic realm, although they both do this critically rather than in approval. Which, that's not a new thing either. When something gets out into the public outside of the scientific realm, scientists tend to start cringing pretty quickly. Alright, ladies and gentlemen, and everything in between and outside of it, it's time for the fun part, criticism. Yay! Because, as with anything that got some sort of traction, KRASHEN'S publications did receive a fair bit of criticism. In fact, in his case, it was actually a lot more criticism than praise, at least from fellow linguists. In fact, the most important points of criticism were also the reason why there was so much of it. Everyone who's been around YouTube for a while should be aware of this. When there's something that whatever bubble, or even if it's everyone, finds obviously wrong, ridiculous, easy to react to and be like, common knowledge tells me that this is stupid, there's going to be a bunch of people who jump onto it. And this is kind of a situation like that. So the input hypothesis and the non-interface position in particular mostly got and still get attacked for their usage of terms that stay too vague and undefined. So the reader may, for example, have a general understanding of what quote-unquote comprehensible input means from KRASHEN'S elaborations and their own ideas about it, because both of those are words that we've heard before and have some sort of idea or, concept of. But they will struggle to then pinpoint its exact meaning in KRASHEN'S mind, because Krashen never clearly defines the idea of what comprehensible input is. He basically just says, well, it's I plus 1, and that's anything that is just outside the realm of what you already know, which is all fine and dandy, but how do you quantify that? Another big flaw that consistently gets addressed is the fact that he neglects to base his theories on empirical data and rather on seemingly self-evident concepts that no one can or even wants to object to. Again, we're familiar with this phenomenon from platforms such as YouTube, because if you use enough stuff that seems like common sense to enough people, it's going to be kind of hard to speak against that, because you're going to have a bunch of people coming back at you like, well, this is self-evident. We don't even need to discuss this. Well, if it's self-evident, why do we need a theory then, right? So this is definitely something you could criticize him for, basically leaning on things that most readers will intuitively go, oh yeah, sure, of course, at, leading to a lack of critical examination of its deeper points and implications. In an article on the topic, fellow linguist Craig Jordan saw the problem with the input hypothesis in that it assumes too much about the learner. For example, how is the learner able to filter out the intended meaning of a piece of input if its level is above their current competence? How does a learner decide what is relevant and what is I plus 1 for them, even if it's not explicitly? But how do they pick up enough on that little morsel of extra info? The intention here isn't to say that this doesn't happen, it's that Krashen doesn't define this. He just says, well, when we have enough input, we will pick something up from it, which you can't really contradict. But the interesting thing scientifically here would be to try and grasp what exactly makes up that morsel of extra, that plus 1. And Krashen doesn't offer much explanation for this rather crucial question. And without it, empirical validation of the hypothesis is not possible, because researchers won't be able to pinpoint exactly what to look and test for in a system as internal and complex as that of language acquisition. So again, quantification. How do we measure something that isn't defined clearly? Another big and perhaps the most harsh among Krashen's critics is Kevin Gregg, who the article he wrote on Krashen's book immediately after its initial publication was fairly clear and fairly mean, actually, in my opinion, about his opinions on it. Nevertheless, and regardless of tone, which actually made me feel kind of sorry for Krashen sometimes, it does raise some good points. That being, A, a lack of evidence and preciseness provided by Krashen for his most crucial points. B, poor or varying definitions for important terminology. And C, the resulting lack of empirical content or a theoretical basis for that matter, which in turn makes his theories hard to impossible to contradict. So again, we have that same criticism. Gregg also accuses Krashen of a sloppy usage of established terms, such as, for example, Chomsky's language acquisition device, which originally referred to the initial state of any human's quote-unquote language center before any kind of input. Basically, like I mentioned earlier, the basic apparatus that we all have in our brain that stores endless capacity for human language that then basically gets programmed to a specific, operating system. Originally, there has to be some sort of language device in our brain, says Chomsky, that is able to learn any human language there is. So that is what the language acquisition device originally is, and Gregg accuses Krashen of misusing the term by using it to refer to all processes involving acquisition in both children and adults, which is actually fairly far from the original concept. But Krashen never bothers to point out this difference or offer any additional information or idea on well, this isn't exactly what Chomsky said, but I'm going to modify it in this way, and I think that is justified because of this. He just basically uses the term wrong, which is sloppy. That's basically what Gregg says. He also brings up the non-interface position, sees it as the single most interesting yet problematic part of the acquisition hypothesis, calling it inconsistent and even nonsense, since Krashen starts off his book or article by pointing out that adult learners use two mechanisms for developing competence in a second language, quote, that being learning and acquisition. But he then later goes on to declare that explicit knowledge never becomes implicit, read acquired, read competence. That's a direct contradiction. Can make either of those claims, of course, but Krashen made them both, and that leads Greg to say, well, which one is it? You can't just be willy-nilly with this, you need to be more exact. This, of course, is nitpicking to the extreme, but he's got a point. Now, Greg attributes the biggest problem with this position to a lack of clarity in evidence, offering examples for what is, in his opinion, opposite processes in the form of himself learning and then internalizing rules for, in his case, Japanese conjugation and polite speech without any significant comprehensible input, or comprehensible input by Krashen's definition, which is what he then calls fairly typical cases. Now, this guy called his article Occam's razor. Well, Occam's razor occurs in the title of his article, and that is a concept that, in case you're not familiar with it, basically says easiest explanation is most likely the correct one. So if there's multiple competing theories, the correct one is probably the one that makes the least assumptions, which then leads to Greg declaring Krashen's theory as bad because it bases too many of its conclusions on assumptions that, according to current knowledge, are a bit too far out there. He also points out that many of Krashen's basic assumptions are easy to agree with for the vast majority of people. We already went over this, which makes it all the more important to provide evidence and a theoretical base for less intuitive and therefore new parts of the theory, which he then fails to do. Again, according to Greg. Now, I think I pointed this out before, but I feel the need to note again that throughout the article, Greg's tone is not very benevolent. I'm not going to go as far as to say that he builds up a straw man consistently. He does make valid points, but he comes across as pretty self-righteous and honestly arrogant. He's unnecessarily mean about it, and he could have just as easily made the same points with a bit more dignity. This does, of course, not discredit his statements, but considering this harsh tone and I don't know if he had any personal beef with Krashen. I didn't read up on that because it doesn't really matter. But just considering the tone, we might want to take some of the very decisive stances he takes with a grain of salt, even though his points are valid. A somewhat more understanding approach is taken by McLaughlin. I mentioned him earlier already. He also points to the lack of definition, which makes it difficult to support one position or the other. Quote, talking about Krashen's and Greg's clashing stances on learned and acquired knowledge. Part 5. So what do I actually think about this? Now, through all of this, it should become clear that the non-interface position is far from undebated. In fact, there have been far more people who have clearly spoken out against it than have rushed to its aid. But the remaining question is, what can be taken away from all this? Is there some validity in explicit and implicit knowledge not interacting at all? And is grammar teaching really essentially useless? Which to me as a grammar nerd is a hugely depressing idea and also just can't be true, right? From this you can see I obviously had a bias going into this topic, and my opinion on this has largely stayed the same, although it has become a bit more differentiated. That being, overall the non-interface position, to me, still is too overgeneralized and flawed, but it can't simply be disregarded either, and it does make some good points, not the least of which being that several of the theories or hypotheses that it develops out of are, as I've pointed out plenty of times now, rather self-intuitive. But I agree with the general big problem that came up again and again in much more established critics than I. That being, Krashen never bothers to clearly define and back up his most important terms, maybe for a lack of clarity about them to himself, maybe for an intended vagueness that allows him to redefine them as necessary, or maybe because he considers the exact specifics unimportant because the concepts seem self-evident to him, and he thinks that the core of his statements is not devalued by their quantifiability, essentially. Which I think is wrong, but I'm trying to understand his approach here. Whichever one of these it is, though, what's problematic about it is that he doesn't leave any ground for clear contradiction because of it. Not because the theory is flawless and the right, the one right way he cracked the code. Now we can all go home happily knowing that we'll never need a grammar book ever again, which again, I personally would find sad, but I'm sure many people would be happy about it, but that's not the point. So far, the one right way just doesn't exist in second language acquisition. And personally, I think it probably never will because people are too different for that. And arguably, our brains are more concerned with language than with anything else. That's not the issue. It's that he doesn't provide enough empirical background and clarity to clearly pick up on and refer to, again, the quantifiability. If you don't make clear what your parameters are, nobody else can pick them up and pick them apart, essentially. What exactly is comprehensible input? How and where can it be applied in a way that would definitely guarantee that no grammatical syllabus is ever needed or useful? Furthermore, KRASHEN'S central piece of logic that I touched on earlier is pretty circular. Only comprehensible input can lead to acquisition, so that means all acquisition must have come through comprehensible input. This claim would be fine if it were in fact undebated that only comprehensible input, which would have to be clearly defined, leads to acquisition. But that's the thing that he's trying to prove, which generally, I'm basing my claim here on general intuitiveness too, but generally, I think we can all agree that circular logic such as this, thing A is thing B because if thing B exists, it must be based on thing A, is not the best scientific method, probably. But the way it stands, two statements that have yet to be proven, and are under much scrutiny at that, are supposed to support each other. And furthermore, to even be able to find this much-needed definition, it would first have to be absolutely clear what learning and acquiring are in KRASHEN'S mind. Specifically, which he only explains on the most obvious superficial level that had been established in linguistics for a while, being implicit, explicit. And looking at Greg's example of his own acquisition of Japanese grammar only through studying, basically, and KRASHEN'S explanation of I+1 being achieved if something is understood, if studying and learning is sorted into explicit knowledge, which means there's a barrier there that cannot lead to acquisition, but he actually acquired something only through learning, then that would mean that the learning qualifies as I+1, making an acquisition, disproving the non-interface position. However, and this is where I kind of understand the frustration of Greg and the stance that he takes, though I still do not agree with his tone, but I get that he got really pissed off at this through the unclarity of the terms. KRASHEN could, and in fact did, state that this was actually not a case of explicit knowledge becoming implicit, but rather that the explicit knowledge gave Greg the ability to, quote-unquote, pretend to have acquired a rule until he then actually acquired it separately from his explicit knowledge of it. Tiny tangent, I just want to point out, this is the power of people with a quick brain and a quick tongue who can basically turn any point around if they're enough, if they have enough conviction about whatever it is that they think. And I'm guilty of this myself because putting it together this way, and this is essentially what KRASHEN said, it sounds ridiculous. It sounds ridiculous and it sounds very bad faith. But that is what KRASHEN said, and I genuinely do not believe that he was just being a pissy, non-cooperative asshole about it. I do think that he was like, no, see, this is actually something that proves my point. Now, the problem with that, though, is a statement like that, the whole oh, but it's just you pretending to have acquired it until you then actually acquired it. That's an unfalsifiable statement. Basically, put more colloquial, there is simply no winning with or rather against this position. You can't argue with it. What are you going to say to that? No, but I'm not pretending. And then KRASHEN says, oh, you poor guy, you actually think you learned something. So again, this is the ultimate proof that without clearly defined terms, no claim that emerges from them can be held accountable. You can't punch smoke. It's just gone. And that's basically what this is. If you leave everything vague enough, you can always jump to a different position or see it from a different angle and tell your opponent, see, no, but that's not actually what I meant. Okay, then you have to say what you mean. Part final. Okay, so now what? So as much as I would love to present a clear-cut argument at this point, there's really no way to definitely contradict the non-interface position without having a clear idea of what exactly it is that needs to be proven in order to do that. Do I need to prove the usefulness of grammar? That seems a bit too trivial, because even Krashen must and does admit that explicit knowledge is not completely without use. Furthermore, it still doesn't necessarily contradict there being no transition. Just because I'm saying, grammar is useful 5 out of 10, alright, but that's neither an argument for or against it being able to turn into implicit or acquired knowledge. And since that last thing is the point that everything depends on, we're stuck on the same problem as all along. So where is the line? What is purely implicit knowledge? And is it really more efficient than a mix between both forms? From a personal standpoint for me, I clearly have to disagree with that. Having concrete knowledge about grammar systems and rules has not only helped me acquire language, it has noticeably accelerated the process at times. I keep personally lauding the ability of adult brains to explicitly pick up grammar, because as fucking impressive baby brains are in being able to just take an input and then just start talking at some point, the huge advantage and superpower of an adult brain is the ability to acquire and use explicit knowledge. And yes, I'm using the word acquire consciously here. And, much like Greg said, I also did that, not in all instances, but in some, without great amounts of input to go along with it. Now, did I have no input? No, because why would I do that? It's stupid, but I also didn't learn it purely through input. Now, I am willing to assume that this does not hold true for everyone, and in fact, I have known people who have learned whatever language to impressive degrees only through input in relatively quick time frames when they put their minds to it. But I do believe that there is value in using explicit knowledge as a stepping stone into implicit knowledge for at least a majority of learners. And while this is no way a scientific observation or a provable claim without actually going into empirical research, from teaching through online video for almost a decade, which is a medium that allows for very little to no direct interaction while the process is happening, which therefore gives very little possibility for effective usage of comprehensible input. I've also gotten responses that make me consider grammar, at least grammar that is well explained, an accelerator of acquisition rather than as an accessory for the linguistically inclined. This can, of course, in no way be considered scientific research, like I said, but I do think that it has its value for what it is. But again, I can't definitely disprove Krashen's hypothesis, because he proves himself by saying, well, if you know it, then you must have acquired it through input. You can't disprove that. I would also like to point out that all this is not to try and diminish the importance of comprehensible input whatsoever. Most language teachers and researchers should very much agree, and so do I, that it is the most important part of fully acquiring a language to just be exposed to it as much as you possibly can. But after doing the research on the input hypothesis, I do stand by my conviction that explicit knowledge can go a long way in not only helping with, but actually becoming implicit knowledge. Alright, so at the end of all this, the somewhat dissatisfying conclusion to this topic and the answer to the question whether or not the non-interface position is justified, it kind of has to be nobody really knows. We can argue, we can present personal examples or empirical data and interpret them according to our convictions, or even try to steel man an argument that is not something we agree with, but without clearer images of what the ground terms for these discussions even are, there won't be a final say, and there doesn't necessarily have to be one. The non-interface position certainly isn't the most diplomatic way of approaching the complicated issue of second language acquisition, nor is it the most, again, quantifiable and confirmable, but it is certainly something that offers food for thought. It's an interesting way of approaching the topic, which is huge, And one thing Krashen and his theories have done, and have done right, is to evoke opinions and research into a direction that was relatively new to the field at the time. So the criticism he receives has to be considered a good consequence, because it keeps the conversation going on an incredibly complex topic that will stay relevant as long as humans exist, because we're not going to stop talking anytime soon, if the length of this video is any indication. One thing we might indeed want to take into consideration is the implications or consequences that this has for how we teach languages specifically and particularly in schools. I don't think it is a secret or a much debatable fact at this point that how we teach languages in classrooms is not ideal, to put it nicely. That is not to say that it doesn't work for anyone, of course, because like with everything, every teaching method is more fitting for some than for others. But it is a lowest common denominator, and the consequence of that is going to be that it's not really ideal for anybody, or at least for a very small number of people. So even if Krashen's theories still aren't provable to this day, were very much debated, still are, and are probably not 100% correct, there is at this point no question about input being hugely important, and that how we used to teach language decades ago, where it was basically just studying grammar books, isn't how it works. So that's why discussions like this are important in the first place. Seeing what we can draw from stuff like this for real world circumstances. As fun as all the academic fighting is, this is actually stuff that real world decisions get based on, particularly and especially in education, of course. I certainly thought it was an interesting thing to dig into, both as a language learner and a language teacher. But there you go. This has been one of my papers.